As Philippe said, my name is Ken Schwaber. I'm most associated, you might be caught. It's now an acceptable way to do things. Something that is worth thinking about, though, is Agile is not actually a process. Now, you'll hear people say, hey, we're doing Agile. It's like, what? I mean, when we got together and decided that we had some commonalities for people who did the Agile Manifesto that we wanted to describe to the world, we described the values we have, and it wasn't even like one thing is right and the other's wrong. It's just we even said, like, we prefer working with people and figuring out how to do things rather than following someone else's process that tells us how to do it. So it's a statement of values and then some principles that went with it. So it meant that would be a way that you could work or do things, but it wasn't actually a thing that you could pick up and follow or use. So for someone to say they're doing an Agile process is an interesting set of thinking. There was a magazine, CIO magazine, that I think it was 2006, came out with a copy that said the Agile 100 CIOs, and it interviewed 100 people that said they were using Agile, and what they all meant was we're doing our work faster. And that wasn't quite what we intended. To me, some of the benefits of using Agile are that, one, our work is more predictable. We can control our risks better. We have higher productivity. We increase the return on investment. And almost all of this comes out of valuing us as people who are intelligent, who want to do our best, and who enjoy our profession, rather than thinking of us as the alternative, which is as a resource. I don't know how many of you are still resources, but if you're not, I've got good news for you. You can be people if you're using an Agile process, which is a vast relief to probably your spouse. This Scrum and your mother-in-law, I wanted to describe this a little. Scrum is, of course, the process that I have. These are many of the companies that are using Scrum, and I have no idea how many people are using it because, just one person, it's hard to inventory. Some, where it most often starts, is where a team of people, a project, starts using it because they're looking for a way to work that's more comfortable to them. And so they start using Scrum, and they're successful. Their customer goes off that night to a cocktail party and is talking to his friends. He says, you're not going to believe it, but I actually saw some software yesterday. The guy said, really? No lie. How do you manage that? And tells him, and he comes into his developer and says, hey, why don't you try building software more frequently too? And starts spreading. So that's the bottom up or viral, and it's what we mostly encourage. The top down is when management in the organization spots that there's something different going on. They come into the engineering, they hear people talking and working together and arguing. They see the customers actually getting software regularly or products regularly, and they start thinking, wow, I wonder if we could do this throughout the organization. I wonder if we could capitalize on this. And that then becomes the top-down thing. And that often is misunderstood. I remember working with the guy in charge of Siemens Telecommunications, and he decided he was going to use Scrum. He bought my first book, and he had it underlined and all stuff like that. And he got his VPs, and he said, we're going to do Scrum. You have a year. Get it in. Wow. Scrum is a huge change in thinking. Agile is a change in thinking. It's a change in the way we approach things. How do you measure when it's done? Now, not to worry, at the end of the year, the VPs all got their bonuses because they were done, and everyone's walking around saying, we're doing the Agile, we're doing the Scrum, but, they weren't. When I work with executives who want to bring Scrum in, I want to test and see, how eager they really are to do this, because often they think that I'm a vendor and I'll sell them Scrum for like $14 million and then their lives will be better. Tends not to work. Actually, that's why we kept Scrum free, so that people couldn't think it was magic or silver bullet or things like that. So when I start meeting with these people, like the guy in charge of engineering and product management, I'll say, so, before we start talking about Scrum, can you help me with something? What problems are you trying to solve with Scrum? And we'll talk for a little, and they're a little annoyed that I'm not just telling them about Scrum, and more interested in their problems. And typically, when we look at the issues they're facing, it's these 7 or some variant of these 7 issues. You know, releases are taking longer, stabilization at the end of the release is taking longer, it's harder to get changes done. The schedules are slipping even when it's taking longer. Quality seems to be going down and the staff is demoralized and turning over. Although with the crashing economy, it seems like staffs aren't turning over as quickly as they used to. And so then I'll say something kind of in your face, which is why I don't get hired a whole lot. And I'll say, so why haven't you guys fixed these? And he's like, wait, we brought this guy in to talk about Scrum, he's asking us why we haven't fixed these things. I said, no, really, just, to be sincere, why haven't you fixed these things? You guys are the ones in charge of the organization. These have persisted and gotten worse year by year by year. Why haven't you fixed them? And I'll say the reason I'm asking this is if you bring Scrum in, it's going to make these problems worse. So Scrum is like if you have a 9-month project or 10-month project, it's like taking some of the functionality in the project and doing it all rather than the 9 or 10 months in 1 month. And so if you had problems and issues that caused this within 9 or 10 months, when they occur within 1 month, it's going to be horrible. So if you think you're going to use Scrum to solve your problems, or just by saying Scrum is going to be better, you're wrong. So I often equate it to mother-in-laws. Those of you that are married, or this may be one for those of you that aren't, they have mother-in-laws. And typically the mother-in-law thinks that their daughter or son could have done better, but whatever. And this is like inviting her to come live with you so she can help you get better by criticizing you and pointing out your shortcomings and weaknesses. And you have to be utterly desperate to do that. So this isn't for the weak of heart or the people that just kind of want to go along and get along. You really have to sincerely want to solve these issues. And that pretty well filters out the people that are going to pursue this from not. I was at Intuit in their QuickBooks division, and a guy comes in and says, hey, Ken, you've been doing this stuff, whatever it is you do, for a while, and just your opinion, we started with waterfall, of course, but we started with some other stuff. Then we did waterfall, and we bought the process, I think it was from the Ernst & Young process, and then they started using, they bought RUP, and they started using Rational Unified Process, and that was pretty good. And then they came up with a version of that called Agile III. And he said, now we're going to adopt Scrum. He said, so what do you think we'll use next? And I'm like, wow, well, that's interesting. I said, I don't know. Actually, it doesn't matter. Because the point is, Scrum is not something that's going to make you better. It's a tool you can use to identify where you have problems and then work on them. But if you don't fix yourself and make yourself better, it doesn't matter what process you use. No tool, no process is going to save you. Again, it's individuals and interactions over process and tools. You guys are like, oh, wow, you mean we're going to have to do some work? I said, yeah. Geez, what a surprise. I don't have anything I can sell you that's going to fix your problems. And worse, when you look at these problems, it's not like you have an optimized, smoothly running organization with some problems. What you have is an organization that's finely tuned and honed to create these problems over and over and over again. So when they say we want to get better, it's not like they're just discarding things that they know don't work. This is what they are. This is what you do. Kind of like looking in the mirror and not necessarily liking what you see. So Scrum is not a methodology. It does not contain instructions about how to get better. Matter of fact, it is full of holes where it doesn't tell you anything. Instead, it's a framework within which we try to build software within one iteration or a sprint. Typically, that's a month, sometimes it's 2 weeks, sometimes a week, it depends, but it is consistent in length. And so it's a tool that we can use, and when we're using it, just like you try to build part of your system in 1 month, you will identify all the reasons why you can't do so. Geez, we don't have an automated testing harness, so it's really hard for us to get all the regression testing done in 1 month. Oh my God, we don't have a build system. you know, we don't have a way of identifying our requirement, you know, and all this becomes very visible for you then to start working on. And it takes years to get better. What a surprise. So it's a little like a dumbbell, you know, there it is, and if you use it effectively, maybe you'll get to be strong and muscular and handsome or beautiful or whatever, but the dumbbell just sitting there isn't going to do it for you. So Scrum's just a tool or a framework. It has been used in all sorts of applications. I remember when we first announced Agile, Martin Fowler said we shouldn't have called it Agile. He said, that's such a neat name, everyone's going to use it. If we call it crack and poof or something like that, then you know, only the people that really want to use it will use it, which is kind of why we've left the word Scrum. It's an ugly word. So you won't go around and say, whatever, we're using Scrum. You say, oh, we're doing stuff better and we're in small teams, and describe it that way. Mark, this is a quote from Barry Bain right after the Agile Manifesto came out. He said, you know, it is a really neat way of developing software. If you have a small, co-located team of great engineers that have worked together for a long time with good engineering tools that know the technology and the domain of work they're working on, and they're working on something of no great significance. and we, you know, we're not that smart, so we sat there feeling very pleased for a while until we realized there was some disrespect in the statement. and then we're like, oh man. So actually, it's not true. We use Scrum in huge, critical situations. Siemens Medical, they use Scrum throughout their entire organization. Their product line, product family line is often 1,200, 1,400 people working together to create a release. Intuit uses it for QuickBooks, Quicken, TurboTax. Cisco uses it throughout the organization. Adobe for its product lines. Northrop Grumman, SAIC, and Essex, and Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory use it for building the fighter of the future, so we can kill more people. So that's a DoD mission critical application. The Mormons use it for their family search project, 200 some people in multiple locations. GE Medical and Medtronic use it for building FDA life critical applications. So I'm going in mid-December to have a stent put in my heart to fill a hole. It was developed using Scrum. I hope Scrum's good. If not, you know, it's been a pleasure. So it's used for large-scale, distributed, dispersed, mission-critical, highly complex, risky applications. It's not just used for trivial things. So also just wanted to note, it is also CMM level 3, and in a number of situations it's CMM level 4 and 5 if it's scaled to an enterprise. It just does the KPIs in a different way, risk management. And it's also used in the ISO 9001R applications. So precision risk management is very good. A warning, a little like the Berlin Wall. A lot of people are really good with waterfall. It has tremendous risk management and techniques and measurement techniques. Scrum also has that. Many people leave waterfall, and when they start using Scrum, all of that mother-in-law stuff that pops up is a little too much. So they leave behind a lot of those practices and kind of wind up halfway between. And what we've seen is when organizations aren't using Scrum appropriately, they wind up with what we call as an iterative incremental death march. That is, that death march you used to have in waterfall that happened at the end of the project, you now have happening every month. You've taken a generally crappy life and turned it into a miserable life. So it's a little like bringing your mother-in-law, and she's pointing out the things that you could do to really become a better son-in-law or daughter-in-law, and it gets too much for you, so you take duct tape and put it over her mouth. Well, you've lost your best source of information about maybe what you could do to improve your software development and your product management practices. So suggestion is, when you bring Scrum in, it exposes all sorts of stuff. You then have a choice of changing or improving those stuffs, whatever, I love the word, or changing Scrum so it no longer exposes them. And often, some people have said, well, we got rid of Scrum because it didn't work. That's right. The intention was for you to change your organization based on what it's exposing, so you are a top-notch product development company. Not for you to change it so it doesn't tell you that you're not anymore. Comforting, but not so good. This is a Stacy graph. It was done by Ralph Stacey, University of Hertfordshire in England. And it's a way of measuring complexity of work. And I wanted to show it to you just to show you where Scrum fits and how it works compared to like Lean or traditional approaches. So in this model, the vertical axis are our requirements. And the horizontal axis is technology. Toward the 0 mark on requirements, it means you have very, very well-known requirements. Not a lot of them, even maybe only one stakeholder. And they're not going to change, and they're very well understood. And this tends to only happen when your stakeholder dies within a couple of days of announcing them. If you leave them alive, they change their mind, right? You're high up on the vertical axis is where you have many stakeholders, the business conditions are changing, people are coming up with new ideas, and that tends to be most of our work. Horizontal axis, if you're using Windows 95 with Visual Basic and Access, you probably have technology that works reliably. Got to find machines for it to work on them. And over on the right side, though, tends to be most of our technology, which is end-tier technology using multiple releases of various different products to build them and deploy them in multiple locations connected in different ways with security demands. And so it tends to be pretty complicated and very changing. Now, if you have simple requirements and simple technology, well known, as everything tends to be known, you have a simple project. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. If you have complex requirements, or some of your requirements are changing, but your technology is stable, you might have a complicated type of situation. Or if you have technology that's going to change, but your requirements are pretty stable, complicated. If you have it where your technology is changing or unstable and your requirements are changing and are unstable, that is, more things are unknown than known, you have what's known as a complex situation. And when you factor in that in our projects, people do the work, and people have moods and attitudes and opinions and prejudices and all the rest of that, almost all of our work is bordering toward the high level of complexity, leading into the chaotic state. So, good to know. So you can go home and tell your friends that you're working on complex stuff. The reason I mention that is the way of you want to manage or do the work depends on how predictable, how well known it is. That is, if you have a simple project or even a complicated project where you know more than you don't know, where things aren't going to change a lot, then what you want to do, and the very most cost-effective way to do it, is to plan and figure out everything before you start working. Figure out all the requirements, all the non-functional requirements, what the architecture is going to be, what the infrastructure is going to be. You might even lay out a detailed plan of who, what resources are going to do what, and how much time it's going to take each one of them, and the dependencies. And then when you've got all that figured out, you start the peak in it, and you can from that predict the price and the date that it'll be done. And then you start out the project, and everyone follows what was known and planned. And at the end, you deliver all the requirements on the technology indicated with the architecture for the price and date expected. And that's success. And that's wonderful. And of course, you have to resist change because that screws up your initial project plan. An alternate approach is if you know that things are going to change on you left and right, then it probably makes sense to minimize the amount of time you spend planning up front. Maybe you, rather than laying out everything that you're going to do, in most of our projects, 35% of our requirements change, maybe it's a good idea just to state the goals, the architecture, maybe we would talk about the technology and overall framework that we'll be using, and we might talk about, figure out what the cost and date probably need to be, and then we'll start working on this project, and we will work for a short period of time, a pulse and iteration. At the end of the iteration, we'll have an increment of something that's done that we could actually use if we wanted to, and we will look at it at the end of the iteration, the pulse, and based on what it is and what changes have happened in the marketplace and the technology we're using, we will inspect it, and we will then make an adaptation of what we're going to do in the next month that will optimize our chances of reaching our goal. So this has continual replanning. This is just-in-time planning rather than upfront planning. A little like a thermostat, where you set it to 70 degrees, that's Fahrenheit, not Celsius. And it periodically inspects the ambient temperature, and based on that kicks in air conditioning or heating. So it has a goal, and it then inspects the temperature and makes adaptations to reach the temperature. So Scrum itself has minimal planning up front, and instead has just-in-time planning throughout the entire process. Now that's a pretty big change, because it implies that overall you may have more planning in Scrum than you do in a traditional project, except that it's just in time at the start and end of every iteration. It also implies that you can't just have the experts plan something and then start going. Instead, you have to use intelligence throughout the entire thing to figure out what are the best things to do and what can you do best with what's going on. And that's a real pain in the neck. Unless you enjoy the work that we do, and then it's not a pain in the neck, it's actually kind of fun, which is kind of more my point of view. So in a traditional project, you plan a huge amount up front, then you develop a lot, and then based on all the changes that happen during the project that you then anticipate, you have a huge stabilization phase where you try to get it all to work together. In Scrum, you have minimal planning up front, and then you have planning at the start of every iteration, let's say a month iteration, and then you have a little bit of development for that planning. Then you plan again, develop, plan again, develop, plan again, develop. And at the end, because you've been taking into account all of the changes as they occur, your stabilization period tends to be very small. So very, very different approach. And changes the thinking. I remember, you get asked what you do for a living. Sometimes kind of embarrassing explaining, like push keys, and I talk to machines, right? And I said to this one guy, who turned out to be a chief financial officer, well, I help people build software every month. And the guy looked at me and says, so I don't have to wait 15 months to get what I don't want then. I said, that's right, we'll give you what you don't want in a month. Because there's nothing about Scrum or Agile that says you will get good results. Instead, it says that you will know where you are so you can do the most intelligent thing possible. Like maybe not even pursuing the project because there isn't enough productivity to do it. Or maybe canceling, stopping the project halfway through because you have enough value already. You don't need the rest of the stuff. And if you're looking at another statistic, which is over 15% of the functionality, most of the products that are released, is never or rarely used, wow, what an opportunity. It would mean that we could maybe even start the project there. Early realization of value, great opportunity. Scrum team is a very small working team. Those of you that have read the Mythical Man Month, when you get over 10 or 11 people working together, the number of communication paths and tangles and webs of them becomes overwhelming. So we keep Scrum teams at 9 or 10 people. And this entire team is responsible for looking at the start of an iteration, or we call it a sprint, at what is the most important thing that they can think of to do right then, figuring out how they're going to do it, and then spending a month building that most important thing. And at the end of the month, looking at how successful they were and whether they got all the stuff done or what problems they did, so that then they can figure out and do another month's worth of work that is equally pointed toward the goal. In Scrum, you're not done when you have delivered all the requirements. You're done when you've accomplished the goal, which is kind of a different approach. In Scrum team, there are 3 clear responsibilities. There's a product owner, which is the customer. And they're responsible for telling us what is the most important stuff we can do every month. And they're also responsible for working with all the stakeholders to make sure none of them are ever surprised. That is, if you have information about where the project or release is every month, there is no need for surprise anymore. You can go tell people how miserable it's going to be after the 1st or 2nd month. And there's no need for surprise. And that's one of our customers' largest complaints is, wow, right before you were ready to ship and we had all the stuff, you told us you were going to slip 5 months. thanks for the information. Second person or group are the developers. And this is a cross-functional team. All the skills needed to turn a requirement into something that's potentially usable. So it would consist of an analyst, a designer, programmers, testers, tech writer, all of them working together to turn the requirements into something that is done. Totally up to them. This is a self-managing team. So there's no process for them to follow. There's no book for them to read. There's a lot of good practices. They're probably used to waterfall, but we leave it totally up to them, their self-managing team, how they're going to take something and do it. So cross-functional self-managing team. And the third person used to be a project manager or a manager, but it's now called a Scrum Master / manager. Now, project manager was the greatest hoax in the world. How we got people to accept the job is unbelievably unknown. You neither did the work, nor did you define what the work was, but you were responsible for the success of the project. Does it pay well? Wow, what a job. So Scrum Master has no responsibility like that. Instead, they're responsible for the process. They're responsible for the way the process is supposed to work, the way the product owner is supposed to work, the way the team is supposed to be self-managing works, and that they aren't interrupted when they're doing their work. So they are the engineering process person for this team. Amazingly, full-time job. This is the way a Scrum process works, and this is fairly common amongst the two primary instantiated Agile processes are Scrum, which is a product management or project management process, and extreme programming, which are the engineering practices that you can use within every sprint. And the two of them go hand in fist like this. Scrum was built by two people, myself and Jeff Sutherland, that own software companies, and we use this to build products. Extreme programming built by Kent Beck, Ward Cunningham, Ron Jeffries, who were engineers, and both of us were using Smalltalk, always using Smalltalk, which was the first integrated development environment, which gave us the ability to do this rapid turnaround or iterative incremental development. And in this, we have a list of requirements, product backlog, we call it, backlog of work or things to do. This is over here. And this is, unlike many requirements or MRDs or PRDs or specification documents, this is a list that is prioritized. And so that when we do work, it's always the highest priority work, highest value work, highest dependency work. And this list we consider an inventory of work to be done. Now, in lean thinking, inventory is not good. Inventory is potentially a liability because if someone doesn't order it, or you wind up with flaws in it, you have to throw it all away. So we only really detail the requirements and work we're going to do for 2-3 months out. If that becomes less and less well known until after 6 months out, it's an idea holder. So we don't build this huge plan up front because we know a huge amount may change, and we only focus on the highest value stuff. The product owner gets together with the team at the start of the iteration and presents with the developers what are the highest priority things that they have to do. And the team talks to them about it, figures it out, and selects as many of them to do as they think they can do, interesting word, in the next iteration or sprint. So just-in-time order processing from this inventory of requirements. The team then takes those product backlog items or requirements, tends to be maybe 4 to 7 per Scrum team per iteration, and they design how they're going to do what they just committed to, come up with a task list of how they're going to do it, called a sprint backlog, and then they spend an entire sprint per iteration doing that work, turning what they selected into what is done and usable by the customer. During that time, since we gave them the highest priority stuff, most valuable stuff we could think of in the whole company, we don't interrupt them, because by virtue of it being the highest value, anything else is of lower value. And even if something higher value comes up during the sprint, we don't interrupt them because Scrum is such a low overhead process that then we have to throw away all the work we did and start again. So it's like, business, leave us alone for this long and you'll actually get something while we work on your highest priority thing. There are exceptions like customers down. Probably a good idea rather than building new stuff to help the customer get back up. But they have a whole sprint to build what we ask them to do. At the end of the sprint, we have a sprint review where the product owner and all of the stakeholders get together and look at what the team's been able to do. Now, it might be more than they said, it might be less. We actually don't care that much about that. What we care is figuring out what they were able to do. So this is empirical rather than predictive. And based on what they were able to do, we all figure, okay, based on what you guys just did and the way things have changed during the last month, what is the next best thing for us to do? And that becomes the work that the team does for the next sprint. So this is an inspect and adapt process. We inspect at the end of every iteration what the team was able to build, and based on that, we make an adaptation to what we're going to do next that will optimize our possibilities of accomplishing or reaching our goal. Interesting. However, a little like financial markets recently, what Scrum demands is transparency. Because like the thermostat, when it goes out to check the temperature, if its sensor is off or it can't detect the temperature because it's fluctuating too much, it can't make a proper adaptation. So this means that the increment that the team builds has to be fully visible and knowable and inspectable within the customer's terminology. So a sequence diagram in an object model is not something that most customers can inspect. A piece of working functionality that they could actually implement and start using is something they can inspect and build on. So that's what we ask the teams to build every sprint. There are two other inspect and adapt cycles in here because of the amount of complexity we work in. One is every day we ask the team to get together and based on what they've committed to inspect where they are and make adaptations to their workload. And at the end of every sprint, we ask the team to get together and talk about how things went during the sprint and what they'd like to do differently in the next sprint. So this is a retrospective, and that's inspect and adapt for continuous process improvement. So 3 places where unfortunately you have to apply keen intelligence and everything has to be transparent. This is the work that's usually done. I'm sure you can all read it clearly. That's a list of all the things that typically you have to do to a requirement to turn it into something that's done. So it goes from analysis through design, through design refactoring, through programming, through fixing some of the other programs that were existing, through unit testing, regression testing, performance testing, stability testing, security testing, and documentation. And then it has variations in every company, like you need to port to 4 different databases, or you might get to internationalize for 25 languages. And this is all work that has to be done for every requirement that a team selects every sprint. And so you can imagine, God bless you can imagine when you start, team starts with its first requirement that it's going to do in its very first sprint, it's kind of tough for them to do all this every sprint. So this is one of the challenges that faces teams, is for them to become better and better engineers and get better and better development infrastructures so that they can do all of this every sprint. Now the reason why this is defined is the team talks and looks to the product owner and says, I think we can do about 5 of these next sprint. Well, what does do mean? Because if the product owner looks at where they are at the end of the sprint, if the functionality is working, and they presume it's done and implementable, but it hasn't been tested, it hasn't been regression tested, all that, they might make an assumption that they're maybe 10% of the way done with the project, whereas they're in reality only like 3% of the way done. So they don't have any predictability. So really important, key thing for me for an organization is I'll walk in and say, so, really weird. I'll say, so what's your definition of done? Because if they don't know when they select a requirement what that means when they say they're going to do it, then they don't know what they're doing. And that means that the quality of what they're going to do is going to be progressively lower and lower. And it means they'll be under pressure to deliver more and more, so they'll cut this definition more and more, and that's where you wind up with the iterative incremental benchmarks every sprint. Scrum Master's job is to make sure the team has a definition of done, and that they adhere to it so that when the product owner looks at something that's done at the end of the sprint, they know what they're looking at. So that way you can do something like a burn down chart. Those of you familiar, it has a vertical axis with work and horizontal axis with time. And you can start with this amount of work and track how much left is left. But that's only if you know what you're looking at. Now, just a thought on this. I was working with a company in Belgium that gathers data for GPS systems, so it acquires all the road coordinates and information so that you can then use a thing like TomTom or Garmin to drive your car or your bike or whatever. And they had entered into a key relationship with a German car manufacturer, and what they were going to do within 2.5 years, them and the German car manufacturer, was they were going to gather new data on the roads. So right now it's 11 feet precision. They were going to get the precision down to 4 feet. So send trucks out and gather more precise data. They were also going to get the slope of the road at different points. And the German car manufacturer is then going to build advanced stability and handling systems that would use that data so that they could outperform anyone else on the roads. So at the end of the first year of the project, I was there, and I was talking to the CEO, a French guy named Elaine, and I said, so how's your project coming? He said, good, really good. He said, how do you know? Well, my people tell me. I said, wow, because I've been here only 2 days and I've been out talking to people, and do you know that they did the work on this key project for the first month and haven't done anything on it for the next 11 months? I said, well, that's not true, you dumb American or whatever he's going to say. And I said, well, geez, I'm just a consultant, why don't you go check? And he did, and sure enough, they hadn't done anything for the last 11 months. He'd come up with all sorts of newer priorities, newer customers, newer opportunities, and they'd say, hey, this is a 2.5-year project, we'll get back to that if we do this and this and this and this. Now, if he had a nice little graph showing the work that was being done on that, proceeding increment by increment as it proceeded toward being done, he would have known he was in deep trouble. And that's kind of like a key responsibility of any manager in any company, particularly like a CEO who's just made a strategic relationship. So this is why it's so important for us to know exactly where we are at the end of every sprint, and why it has to be something that is potentially shippable. And when you start using Scrum, that's not possible usually. It usually takes 2 years to get the engineering practices and infrastructure to be able to do that. But then you actually know where you are. And we can be just like a sales organization where every month, sales organization makes a baseline plan, a prediction of what they'll deliver. And every month we look at their sales figures and adjust the way the company works based on their progress. Wow, we could even every month now look at where we are toward a release, and based on that we could make adjustments in the rest of the company on where we are. But you have to know where you are at the end of every month. This is from a magazine, Harvard Business Review. And I like using this because it's Harvard Business Review is not written by geeks. By definition, a geek is, what was that thing someone said, beware of geeks bearing formula? So, and we're not necessarily trusted, but this is Harvard Business Review, November of last year, an article, Leadership Frameworks by Stone and Boom. And remember that Stacy graph I showed you a long time ago, earlier? This takes and takes the same structure and talks about characteristics of each one of those 4 quadrants, and also what are best management practices if you're doing that type of work. And I just want to walk through this with you for a minute. Simple characteristics are you have repeating patterns, you have consistency, there's clear cause and effect relationship between what happens at one point and what happens at the next point. You have well-known, well-established knowns, and you can have fact-based management because you always know what's happening. So in this case, everything tends to be known. And in this case, you use best practices. You don't need to talk a lot. You just have the resources that are working on the work to do exactly what they've been told to do based on the patterns and the knowns. And you use command and control. You lay out the work and you tell people what to do, they do it, you're successful. And actually, if you can lay out the pattern that people do it over and over again, you can have a very good optimized process. If you have a situation complicated where some things are unknown, but more things are known than unknown, then you're in a situation where you have more predictability than unpredictability. Again, it's fact-based management, but you're going to have wrinkles in what you're doing. Things aren't going to quite work out as unexpected things occur, so you need experts to help you work out the wrinkles. And in this case, you're going to use experts to gain insights into what's going wrong from your process. You're going to use metrics throughout to spot any aberration or deviation from what's going on so you can apply that expert thinking and straighten it out. And again, command and control because there's more predictability. This is the first, the simple, is the purview of the standard Frederick Taylor scientific management manufacturing process, say a car manufacturing line. The second is the purview of lean, where you're expecting for there to be some things that don't go right. So you have self-managing teams and you're looking at this heavy use of statistics to spot what's going right and wrong. The third, which is where we live, is where it's complex. And here, there's more things unknown, more unpredictability than predictability. And in this case, you have not necessarily answers you can figure out up front, but they tend to emerge as you do your work. I mean, does that sound kind of familiar? And also, you have many competing ideas about what the best idea might be at any point in time. Hey, we should do this, no, we should do that. So a lot of good ideas about what to do as things emerge. And in this case, the technique is to create a bounded environment, or what's called a container, and you take some part of that very complicated work or complex work and you bound it, like with a sprint, and you let a team of self-managing people address that complex work that they're looking at and turn it into something that's useful. And during that time, you have someone who you might call a Scrum Master who protects them from the rest of the things that are changing and being and going on. So we create a container, we select some things to work on within the container of a sprint for a Scrum team to work in where they're not being interfered with. And in this case, we need a high level of interaction and communication because there's a lot of unknown things, so people have to talk a lot. You have to figure it out on your own. Experts aren't going to help you. Wow, that's awful. And in this case, the management, and this is a huge foot that we struggle with management, is they are no longer command and control telling you what to do. Instead, they are servant leaders doing anything they can to facilitate and help you do your work as you struggle to turn these things into something that's useful. It's a tremendous shift in management where they're serving and helping the developers, and tremendous shift for the developers where they're not being told what to do, but they're being asked to use their intelligence and common sense to figure out how to do what they're being asked to do. Big shift. In this case, we're looking for probing, sensing, and responding. If you're in chaotic state, I think Werner von Braun, the German rocket scientist, he said, I always know when I'm in chaotic state because I don't know what I'm doing. So there, what we just do is try to find the most important things or anything we can find that's visible and drag it down into a complex state, bound it with the container of a sprint, and work on it. So in a lot of the Agile discussion groups and a lot of the even Scrum discussion groups, you'll see a lot of variants of this, of people saying, well, we should do this or this or this or this. And there are all sorts of techniques. There's Six Sigma, there's risk management techniques, there's Lean, there's all this. And they each have their place. But what we've established here is a process which is optimized for complex product development. And the other approaches are interesting and nice, but they're not necessarily relevant. Then we have ideas, like we've adopted a lot of Lean ideas, but you can't use the lean techniques or lean thing as a way to manage complex development. We've used Scrum in some very big, risky projects, and I just want to talk a little about how to do this. And it started when I had a team of 17 people, which is more than you should have, right? No more than 9 or 10. But it was because I couldn't figure out how to take one piece of work, which was so intertwined and interdependent, and had so few people that knew it, I couldn't figure out how to get a smaller team. So every day there's a daily scrum, stand up where the team gets together for 15 minutes and talks about what they just did and what they're going to do next to optimize their delivery against their commitments. 17 people in 15 minutes is impossible. So I got them together after the 4th and 5th day. I was still thinking I was in charge, the Scrum Master. I got them together and said, so is this working? 17-person team, 15-minute daily Scrum? And he said, no, it's terrible. So I'm like, wow, okay, so I really screwed up. And he said, so what should we do? He said, oh, we already did it. We broke ourselves into 4 teams. And through my mind is going to the thought of, how dare you? I didn't give you permission, but I was smart enough not to say it, right? And I said, oh, okay, so you're in 4 teams. How do you handle all the dependencies that I couldn't figure out? And they said, oh, we know the code. You know. We talk with each other and we work the dependencies, and we're smart people. I'm like, wow, you're not dumb resources, you're smart people. This is neat. But that wasn't good enough. So I said, okay, but at the end of the sprint, you can't give me 4 increments. I demand to show that you actually resolved all the dependencies, that you give me one integrated, integration-tested working increment. And I was really being tough, and they looked at me like, duh. And I'm like, okay. So then I pushed on where I probably shouldn't, and I said, oh yeah, well, what about the daily scrum? And they said, well, we have 4 daily scrums right before this one. I'm like, how dare these people, be intelligent, they need me to tell them. And I said, okay, what about this daily scrum? And I said, well, we just need this one for you. And that's where I started getting this insight that these people that we do our work with, that drive on the same freeways as us, live next door to us, go to church with us, all that, are probably intelligent adults that are capable of thinking. I mean, who would have guessed it? Not anyone who's ever built a Gantt chart, because that's what you've got to be told what to do. So if we have a Scrum team from that concept, what we do is, if we have more work or we want to go faster than one Scrum team can, we break up the work into parts and we form 3 Scrum teams or 5 Scrum teams or 7. No more than 9 Scrum teams again because of complexity of interdependencies. And we ask those teams to do their parts of the work, and we can parse the work out by feature, by function, by architectural component, by next-gen project, by common components, by anything. And we ask those teams to do the work. And at the end of each sprint, each team has to have their increment done. But because they are doing work that's been allocated to them by this team, by the way, no longer does work. They just distribute and integrate and parse. What we ask is that these teams at the end of every sprint, they're not done if their work doesn't integrate into an integrated increment that can be integration tested and is done at the next level. That gets hard. It means your integration capabilities and facilities and all the things and automated testing tools need to be better. If you're nuts and you hire 900 people, you may have a CEO or general manager at the top level with the work of a product family. The next level might be their vice presidents with the work they're doing, the product backlog being parsed into that. The next level might be directors, the next level might be managers, except they're not just their titles anymore. Now they're director-scrum master or director-product owner, so the responsibilities up there. And if we have maybe 80 teams, 90 teams, 100 teams going, we still demand that at the end of every sprint, all of their work integrate into one increment that shows where that product is at the end of the sprint. Now, it's probably a good idea if you're doing monthly sprints not to wait till the 29th day. And you might find that. So it often then forces all these teams to build an integration environment where they have to pull all the work together at least weekly or maybe even daily. so that you actually know where you are every month. Now the advantage of this, competitive advantage, is like Intuit TurboTax. You guys pay taxes? I heard Canada's kind of free. No? Thought that's why at immigration, keep the tax-paying Americans out. The tax product used every year, the last 3 months of the year, states and federal government changed the tax tables, changed the tax codes. In the first 2 months of the year, they also do this. It took the Intuit TurboTax division, which runs it either as a package product or as an ASP, about 2 to 3 years to make it so they could build an integrated version of their total TurboTax product every day. That's 1,200 developers. Pretty hard, but they can do it. So their competitors, CCH Computax and H&R Block, aren't using Scrum. They're starting to scramble now. And it takes them 3 to 4 weeks to integrate changes into their product and release it. If you're using TurboTax, you have the most current tax information as of that day. Which one do you want to use? That is a huge competitive advantage that they won, not necessarily by Scrum, but by using Scrum to improve and point out all their weaknesses and flaws and get better and better until they could produce a product every day. CCH Computax is starting on Scrum to do this, but they are 3 to 4 years behind, and that's a competitive advantage that Intuit has earned that they can never catch up on. So this sort of thing about using Scrum to become better engineers, better product companies, Scrum's kind of irrelevant. It's just a way of getting there, is something which, as I said, makes our companies more competitive, makes them more profitable, gives them advantages over other companies, and makes it a really neat place to work again. Because we actually get to build quality products that have to be integrated frequently. And it's kind of fun. And a lot of Scrum and a lot of the Agile was us getting together, looking at the way software is being built and saying, you know, it's kind of lousy, we don't like doing it. Where's the fun that we had anticipated when we got into this profession? And how do we bring the joy back? And that's where, you know, all the people you see around this room and all of you, you know, it's a pleasure to work with you because this is really important stuff. Creating a profession where when we come to work in the morning, we're doing good stuff with integrity, with our buddies that we have pleasure doing. And I encourage you to use anyone you can of us to help you, to work with each other to do it. This is, you know, a neat place of work. So congratulations, and I look forward to working.